So now we are moving one step back. We heard that there is a clear division, and the reasons for the division, and maybe even an answer what should be done about that. Let's take one step back and ask the original question, is there a divide? And for that, we are having a panel of 3 participants. I will ask them in a minute to join us. The first one is Professor Dov Waxman, who is a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies, and the Stochki Professor of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies at Northeastern University. His research focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli foreign policy, US-Israel relations, and American Jewry's relationship with Israel. He has received his PhD and MA from the Johns Hopkins University and taught in many universities in the US, Britain, and Israel. He is a recipient of many awards and honors, and is the author of 3 books. The last one is, the latest one, is Trouble in the Tribe, the American Jewish Conflict over Israel, which was published less than 2 years ago. The second participant is Rabbi Avi Shafran, who is the Director of Public Affairs for the National Orthodox Organization Agudat Israel of America. He writes a weekly column for Hamodia, that's the daily newspaper of the party or organization, on an Orthodox daily newspaper, contributes regularly to Haaretz and Forward, and is the author of 5 books, including a collection of essays entitled It's All in the Angel. And the third one, is the Nadine Epstein, who is the editor-in-chief and the CEO of the Jewish magazine Moment. You could see the journalists over there. I see that there are still some of them were left there. An excellent paper, a Jewish winning publication that was found in 1975 by the Nobel Prize laureate Elie Wiesel and Jewish activist Leonard Label Fine, who served as the magazine's first editor from 1975 to 87. Her work has appeared in other publications, New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, Smithsonian, the Christian Science Monitor, Ms., and other publications. She taught in the master program in journalism at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She has co-written 3 books, contributed to anthology collections, and co-written a documentary film which was shortlisted for the Academy Award. So I invite these 3 speakers to join us. Please join us. And now we are going to, we want to have a vivid conversation. So I asked the participants to talk very briefly for 5-6 minutes, not more than that, and I will stop you if you'll take this 6.5 minutes. So we can have a conversation among us, and I want you to participate. We'll start according to the program. So who is going to start? I think that the first one is going to be Dov Waxman. Okay. Go ahead.
Great, thank you very much, Yoram. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciated listening to Talia Sasson's speech this morning. I'm going to echo some of her remarks. To get straight to the point, since Yoram is going to be keeping strict time here, I think when we talk about the question of whether there is a gap opening up, whether these 2 communities are becoming more distant, I want to distinguish what we mean by that. Whether we're, on the one hand, if we think about it in terms of the relationship between American Jews and the Israeli government, clearly, indisputably, there is a gap that is clear. The evidence for that we're all familiar with. We've seen this time and again, not just on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, where there is obviously a wide gap in attitudes, and this is borne out in all of the survey data, but also on many, many other issues that you've already heard about this morning in terms of religious pluralism in Israel and in terms of democracy in Israel. The gap that exists between the current Israeli government, or previous ones at least, under Prime Minister Netanyahu and American Jewry is not new. There's nothing new about a gap between American Jews and Israeli governments. If you think back to the early 1980s or with the Begin government, there was a similar gap. There was a gap between American Jews and the Shamir government. Generally speaking, whenever you have a right-wing government or a center-right government in power in Jerusalem, there is going to be a gap, a difference between that government, its policies, its political instincts, if you like, and the views and political preferences and beliefs of at least the majority of American Jews who remain liberal in their views and dovish in their opinions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there's nothing really new in that. I think what we need to be focusing on is not so much the gap between American Jews and Israeli governments, but rather the gap between American Jews and Israeli Jews. Because this is, in many ways, the more profound gap, and this is one that I think is widening over time, and one that I think, in a much more serious way, pulls at the fabric of that relationship. And I'm just going to very briefly focus on this in a couple of areas. First of all, when we talk about the political tensions between American Jewry and Israel, it's very easy and it's somewhat politically convenient to pin the blame on the leader on Balfour Street, to say basically it's Bibi's fault. But that masks the fact that actually politically, much of what the Israeli government does has the support of the Israeli Jewish public. Certainly when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is a clear gap in views between what American Jews think about the conflict and what Israeli Jews think about the conflict, unquestionably. Put simply, American Jews are more optimistic about the resolution of the conflict, more supportive of a two-state solution today, and more critical of Israeli settlement building in the West Bank than are Israeli Jews. So there is a gap there, and that gap, I think, is growing. In other words, I think what's happening is, in many ways, at least since the collapse of the Oslo peace process, Israeli Jews have broadly speaking, shifted to the right, whereas American Jews have become more fragmented, but in some respects have remained where they are, or if anything, moved somewhat to the left. So that gap is opening up, and that's one we're familiar with, and I think that gap is going to widen, not just on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we also see it on questions now of democracy and minority rights within Israel. So, for example, we've heard already mention about the issue of African asylum seekers in Israel. Well, the expulsion of those asylum seekers was supported by the majority of Israeli Jews. It's not just the Israeli government, it's also something that Israeli Jews supported. Similarly, when it comes to attitudes toward non-governmental organizations, Israeli Jews, for the most part, are, in their political views, fairly illiberal in their attitudes. American Jews are strongly liberal. So I think there's a real issue there. Turning very briefly to the issue of religion, the religious differences. Obviously, there's always been a difference in the sense that while Israeli Jews are at least nominally Orthodox in the sense that that's the synagogue they don't go to, in the American Jewish context, of course, most, or at least half of the American Jews who belong to a synagogue are either Reform or conservative. And so, I mean, and Reform or conservative is almost non-existent in Israel, just 5% of Israel. Well, in the most, I'm being told by a very authoritative source, Rabbi Jacobs, that it's 10%. In the Pew survey that I saw, it was less than that. In any case, there was a big difference in terms of denominational affiliation, but it goes deeper than that. If we look at their religious practices and beliefs, at least in terms of the survey data, you'll see that Israeli Jews are typically more traditional, more religious, and certainly much more likely to believe in God and believe that God gave Israel to the Jewish people than are American Jews. And again, there's a gap opening up. If we look at the trend line, what we see is American Jewry, in some respects, becoming more secular, although the Orthodox community is growing, whereas Israeli Jews, over time, in some respects, have actually become more religious. So again, in those two areas, which I think are key areas of tension and conflict over religious life, religious values, who is a Jew, etc., as well as over political questions, we see a gap and a distance, not just between the Israeli government and American Jews, but actually between these two Jewish communities, the two largest Jewish communities in the world today. I think what's remarkable, given this gap, as I very, very briefly described it, is the fact that despite that, where we don't see a gap as yet is in their emotional attitudes. Emotionally speaking, both communities still believe that they share a common destiny. American Jews, for all the talk that we've heard about criticism of Israel, which has been growing, most American Jews still identify with Israel, still are attached to Israel, 2/3 attached to Israel. Even young American Jews are attached to Israel, despite what you may have been told about all the distancing that's happening. So what's remarkable is that both of these communities continue to believe, adhere to this notion that we are one, that they belong to a common Jewish people. I think that belief, which is remarkable, given the fact that these are two different communities who have very different histories and demographic characteristics, that emotional connection is what will be tested going forward in the years ahead. But precisely because we're more aware of our differences, political differences and religious differences, than ever before. I'm not sure whether those differences didn't exist in the past as well, but they were perhaps less magnified. They weren't the focus of conversation in the way that they are today. But now we are increasingly aware of what divides us, American Jews and Israeli Jews. I think that will, in the years ahead, increasingly challenge the belief that we are one and the attachment and the emotional connection that, for the moment at least, remains strong. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dov. So on one hand, you broaden the analysis that we had and by saying that it's not only the Israeli government, but the Israelis at large. On the other hand, you spoke only about criticize, if I could use that word, criticize the developments in Israel. So I know you don't need time for that, but I'm going to ask you later, think about it. Two questions. One, don't you have any criticism of the American Jewry behavior? And B, what can be done about that gap? Think about it for later. But just to emphasize what he said, many in Israel, including high-ranking officials, say that the reason for the American progressives, particularly the reforms, attitudes towards Israel, is that they withdraw from supporting Israel, not because of Israel, but because they are leaving their Jewish base. They have an identity crisis. Less and less of them will continue to be Jews, and the attitudes regarding Israel is a reflection of their own problems within themselves. I'm sure that we'll hear about that later on. So now we'll hear, I guess, a different position. Please, Rabbi Shafar.
Thank you so much, and thank everyone here. I am so deeply impressed that we've been sitting here for almost 2 hours and not one cell phone has gone off. And I just have to thank you for that because I think it's a wonderful. I've never seen it before, actually. A slight correction. The name of the most recent book that I've written is called All in the Angle, not Angel. I don't profess any expertise in angels, so I don't know anything about them.
Can you hear it?
No. I can shout if you would like to. Any better? Thank you. I'd like to, I'm not sure if I'm taking issue or not, but I do believe that when we ask the question of is there a divide, of course there's a divide. We're Jews. There's going to always be a divide. So I don't think that's much of a question there, but I don't know if I'm taking issue with Professor Waxman or not, but the way that I've seen, at least the statistics that I've seen, seem to imply that the divide is really among Israeli Jews and among American Jews, not between the two so much. There's not a great gap in the percentages between Israeli Jews who feel that two-state solution should be the ideal, and the American percentage who feel that way. There's certainly no gap whatsoever between the vast majority of Israeli Jews who seem to feel that the Palestinian leadership is not showing true interest in reaching a fair and secure agreement. American Jews also feel that way to a large degree. When it comes to all sorts of different major issues, I think the divide is within each Jewish community, and it's essentially the same. It's 30%, 40%, and the rest of it unsure. Needless to say, though, there definitely is a, for lack of a better word, progressive American Jewish community that does not have an emotional connection to Israel, or has a quasi-emotional connection to Israel. A recent study in this area, Washington, D.C. area, found that fully 40 to 50% of young adults, and that's of course what matters because that's the future, said they felt little or no emotional connection to Israel at all. That's a frightening statistic. Now, it's only one community. A similar study was done in Northern California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I lived for 7 years. I know it's not representative of the rest of the country, to put it mildly, but it's still, as California goes, as the saying goes, so goes the rest of the country, so I wouldn't discount that either. So there definitely is a segment of the population, the American population, that is at odds with the majority of both American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. But the one point that I'd like to make, and I was told originally that we would have 20 minutes, so I have to condense my words very, very much. The main point I was going to make was about the elephant in the demographic room, and that is my community, the Orthodox one. Because, and I'm not engaging in any one-upmanship or theology here. I'm not talking about making distinctions regarding what's better or what's worse, or what's right, what's wrong. I have respect for all Jews. And I even have a begrudging respect for Jewish movements that I feel are not necessarily representative of the Jewish religious tradition, because they're keeping Jews Jewish. But I have to note, nevertheless, and we don't like doing this because we get accused of being quote-unquote triumphalist when we mention these things. But the statistics in America, and it's not so different in Israel, but we're talking about America here, the statistics clearly show that the ascendant Jewish community in terms of population and attachment to Jewish ideals, including Israel, ironically, it used to be Haredim who were against Israel, there still are some, against the concept of it, but ironically, the American Orthodox community, and the Haredi one included, is extremely pro-Israel, to a fault, actually, I personally say, because I think that my community goes overboard on many things, but I'm something of an outlier in those things. But not to get too far afield, the American Orthodox community is the only one that's really growing, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. It's quadrupled over the past 20 or 30 years. And even though we are only between 10 and 15% of the American Jewish population, virtually all American Orthodox Jews are Jewishly active, belong to or attend at least regularly a synagogue. An amazing statistic that was I came across, and I'm actually quite shocked by it myself, in a paper by Jack Wertheimer and Stephen Cohn. I'll quote directly from it because it's really germane. We must temper these findings by the sobering reality that both the conservative and reform-affiliated populations have been shrinking. The two major movements outside of Orthodoxy are losing market share. Listen to these numbers. Only 11% of American Jewish adults are members of conservative synagogues, and only 14% members of Reform temples. Now, the Reform movement is the largest movement in terms of self-identification, meaning if you ask American Jews who they affiliate with, they'll say the Reform movement, I think it's a bit over 30%, 35%. But according to what these sociologists claim, only 14% are members of Reform temples, 11% of conservative synagogues. And if the Orthodox community is only, let's take the low end, 10%, every one of that 10% is Jewishly active and belongs to a synagogue. So I think this portends something, and this I may be getting into the second session, the afternoon session. I don't want to do that and encroach on it. But I think that we have to look ahead a little bit and realize that for better or worse, I'm not making a value judgment here, and I'm certainly not engaged in theology here. You can invite me back for that another time. But the future in America is going to be increasingly Orthodox. And I think that that portends a stronger connection between the American Jewish community, which will increasingly become an Orthodox Jewish community, and Israel. So I think there are grounds for optimism there. And I think, being that outlier, the person who thought very highly of Mr. Obama and thinks very poorly of Mr. Trump, a person who is very strongly in favor of a two-state solution, I think I'm an outlier. But I think that what we need to do, those of us who share those values, is to try to impress upon the Orthodox Jewish community, and it's not a hard job. Of course, we have our crazies and we have our right-wingers and whatnot, but we also have our reasonable people, and it's the vast majority of them. And they are open to what, in fact, the Haredi leadership in Israel has always proposed, which is that Jewish lives are more important than Jewish land, and that there needs to be a modus vivendi between the Jewish people in the land of Israel and the Arab population. I think we'd do better to focus on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess that the figures that you mentioned will be debated later, but I do want to support your position regarding the question of youth and education. And in one of the surveys that I saw that there are 1.5 million Jews in the United States, the age 5 to 18, and only a third of them get Jewish education. So how this will impact their Jewish identity and their attitude towards Israel is a very good question that we should discuss. And now the third participant, please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Great. So recently I was invited to speak at the Global Forum for Anti-Semitism in Jerusalem. And the first thing that started was Naftali Bennett, who's the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, got up and he explained how Israel is here to help poor American Jews to help them deal with anti-Semitism. And also that American Jews, except for the Orthodox, which are assimilated, and that's why they have issues with Israel, and that they don't care anymore. And I have to say that as editor of a magazine that covers America's Jews, I was like, oh, I had to cringe, and I found myself staring right into that gap that we're talking about today. So this is a topic that I've thought a lot about, and the magazine has thought a lot about, and I brought a few things here just because we did a big symposium called The Growing Gap Between Israel and American Jews a few years ago. Dove is in it. I wish Avi had been in it. But Danny Gorders, lots of interesting people. We tried to have a whole range of opinions because you got to read all these opinions so you can understand where you stand, and I think that's really important. We've also done a few other things on the same topic, including a whole series about what children in America and Israel learn about each other, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And also a recent piece in this current issue which you have, which is about Hollywood and Israel, which is going to deal a little bit with the Natalie Portman issue, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. So I did actually go through the whole thing and sort of review all the different opinions that people have. And I think we're going to hear a lot about that today, and I'm going to not really cover that, except that pretty much everybody doesn't agree with one another. And there's kind of really two sides to it. Generally, liberals in the U.S. and Israel blame the gap on the Netanyahu government, and including charged issues like asylum, and the Israeli government, like Naftali Bennett, basically blames it on the United States, American Jews who just don't understand. And there's others who blame it on generational, geographic differences, religious divides, democratic versus authoritarian. Also, American Jews are resentful because Israel's not the center of the Jewish world anymore. But generally, they all believe the gap is still bridgeable. So we decided to do a deep dive into one area, and we looked into what children learn about each other. And so I'm just going to quickly tell you some of the things we found. We found American Jews invest lots of money and resources into teaching about Israel at all sorts of educational levels. But it's a complicated question, how much do you teach about the conflict? We found that there's a very rich debate about this topic, which is really good. We found that Israeli students learn almost nothing about the American Jewish community in any school venue. They learn nothing about the diversity. They learn nothing about Jewish history. They know nothing about Jews and civil rights here in the United States. They know nothing about anything. They learn about dead Jews in Europe. That teaching about American Jews is sort of anti the Zionist ethos in schools. Except there are some after-school programs, including like in the Tali schools, a couple private schools, but generally those are schools that you have to opt into being part of. Basically, even after-school curriculum now in Israel is farmed out to groups that are connected either to Naftali Bennett's Israeli Home Party or other conservative parties in Israel. Also, Bennett has promised that he's going to add diaspora, like teaching about the diaspora, to curriculum in Israeli schools, and nothing has happened. So they're not learning about Orthodox Jews in the United States, they're not learning about Reform Judaism, they're not learning about conservative Jews, they're not learning about all the Jews who don't have any real connection to a synagogue, which doesn't mean that they're not Jews, because there are a lot of Jews in the United States who don't view synagogues as their first expression of Judaism. A few other quick observations. I think that the gap hurts us. The gap that's fed by Israel's the government's move to the right in Israel has impacted our politics. It's helped move American Jews to the right. It's helped lead to the election of Trump, and especially in terms of funding. So it's something that concerns us in a whole different way. There are some liberal American philanthropists who I know very well who are absolutely disgusted with Israel's government and are just not going to be giving money to Israel. And also that there's a whole other angle here that we haven't talked about, which is new Israeli-American groups that have come up, like the IAC, that are funded by Adelson and others, who have jumped into the American political fray. And they want to be players in America. They want to close this gap. They have a very skewed idea of what American Jewry is, and I think we really need to be paying attention to that. So a couple last points is that Israel needs to do a lot more than Hasbara. We see that the Genesis Prize is in a way Hasbara, and we see that it can really backfire. And you can read a little bit more about this in the Hollywood story that's in your issue. So in that there's a lot of work ahead to connect the Natalie Portmans of the world back to Israel in a positive way, back to being able to attend a ceremony like the Genesis Prize in Israel, should I say. And that the most important thing is that we need to start educating Israelis. We need to take the step of actively working to educate Israeli leaders and citizens and those kids about American Jewry and diaspora. And if we don't do that, we can't rely on the Israeli government to do that. We have to do that. We need to have reverse birthrights. We need to do all those things that we're not doing. And I feel like almost nothing is happening in that area. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting. So again, more criticism of Israel. I happen to support a lot of it, but it's painful. So please help me. Please help me. Give us some criticism from American Jewish behavior, and what can be done about that?
Okay. So in terms of, I think fundamentally, where I would be critical over time is the investment, emotional and identity investment in Israel, as opposed to making the same kinds of investments in American Jewish life here. I think the sense that American Jewish identity, American Jewishness has for too long rested on pro-Israelism. I wouldn't necessarily call it Zionism, but pro-Israelism, as opposed to really investing in Jewish literacy in the United States, Jewish history, and American Jewish identity. I think that is fundamental, and I'm not saying that Israel and a connection to Israel, I do think should be an essential part. I think it is important, but I think there has been a over-concentration, if you like, of both material resources and emotional resources in the investment in Israel and the neglect of American Jewish institutions. For example, why is there a lack of, why do few Jews send their children to day schools? Because it's very, very expensive to do so. So I think if instead of subsidizing so much for American Jews to go into Israel, we're not subsidizing the cost of Jewish life in the United States. I think the other issue there is not just that Israel has become there's been an over-concentration or an over-reliance on Israel in the construction of American Jewish identity and in American Jewish politics, but also that it's rested upon an idealization of Israel, a fantasy of Israel. So one of the things is many American Jews who are gradually discovering that Israel is not this land of the Exodus that they imagined, are shocked and appalled or dismayed by this and want Israel somehow to live according to their idealized fantasy of Israel. First of all, I think Israel should change and reform its policies for Israel's sake, not because it upsets American Jewish fantasy of Israel. Israel needs to live because it's in Israel's interest. But I also think that the idea that the way in which we've taught Israel in this country, not just in this country, but around in the Jewish diaspora in general, as you can tell from my accent, the way in which Israel is taught, the way in which Israel is spoken about, is not as a real country with real problems, which is any country has, but rather as this completely mythic fantasy land which can never sustain critical attention and scrutiny. The minute anybody then actually goes to Israel, learns about Israel, they will immediately become disillusioned because nothing can live up to that fantasy, and therefore the disillusionment and even alienation is inevitable. So I think most fundamentally, I could go on and on about other issues in the organized American Jewish community, but that's a separate thing. But more broadly, in terms of what American Jews have done wrong, I would say, to repeat, the overemphasis upon Israel attachment as the source of Jewish identity and Jewish continuity, and the way in which Israel is portrayed has been ultimately one that actually does more harm than good, because it doesn't allow people to develop a much more complex understanding of the country and its society, and not just this land of milk and honey.
Thank you. Anything Nadine or you, Rabbi Shafran, wanted very much to say in the first round and you were not able to, you can say it now, or interact with each other and you can join us, please. So who is going to start? Nadine, you?
I was just going to say that there are a number of things that we can do. I do think that we have to get out of our own bubbles. We get in our own bubble in our own communities, and we need to be in bubbles where we're with Orthodox and bubbles with people who are unaffiliated, and get out of our political bubbles. So that's really incredibly important, because I think our conversation gets very limited about what Israel is. We just talk to the people who we agree with all the time, like in the United States, within our own community. And then we have to get out of our own bubbles. Every time I go to Israel, I have to get out of my bubble. I have to go someplace, talk to some people I've never talked to before. And I do have to realize and always think about Israel is a country, and it's really got, you have to separate the government from the idea and the concept of Israel. And so, I think that people are often really disappointed. I mean, young people who go to, school and who learn only about the most positive aspects of Israel then are incredibly disappointed when they get to college, or some of them are, and realize, hey, there's other parts of things I didn't know about. It's better that they know about them ahead of time and be a little bit more sophisticated in their thinking. So those are things that we can do here.
I could not agree more about getting out of bubbles. I live for that ideal, and it's a difficult one, particularly when one is trying to mix bubbles from different political points of view. Obviously, it's important for people to hear and weigh objectively other people's points of view. But what I would, what I would suggest that might be a step toward debubbleization of the Jewish community in America is something that's actually going on, and I wish it would continue and grow even greater, which is interaction among different kinds of Jews with regard to Jewish texts and Jewish tradition, because I believe that identity is more important than any of the political issues. It's the connection to our past that I think will empower our future. There's a program, for instance, called Partners in Torah. I have nothing to do with it, other than the fact that my wife spends an hour or more a week on a regular basis discussing and reading Jewish texts with a woman whom she never met, a woman who's married to a non-Jewish man, lives in Arizona, and they are representative, this chavuta, this pair, my wife and her friend, and they're very close to each other. They're representative of thousands of other such pairs that are studying by phone once or twice a week Jewish texts, non-judgmentally, not to push any point of view, certainly not to convert anyone or to change anyone's life, simply to connect to random Jews who would never have had anything to do with one another, with something that they have in common, which is their Jewish heritage. Chabad is famous for such things, but I think all those kinds of interactions, whether they are Orthodox as these two are, or from whatever movement or group or individual that they might be facilitated by, are extremely important. Because if you move politics off the table and move, forgive me, even Israel off the table, and move all of the things that divide us off the table, and focus on what it is that we all have in common, and that is our heritage, I think that leads to something that will make us a better people regarding all the things, even the political and Israel issues.
So if we come out in the evening with a title, "Let's de-Babelize,"
Trademark. I
Babelization.
claim the trademark.
It's a wonderful term. A good topic for your journal, or for a program on Fox News. Do you want to say?
Well, it's very, very interesting to listen to you all and see the differences, and I have to learn a lot as an Israeli about the Jewry of America. And I agree with you totally that people in Israel, well, with all my thing that I don't know, I'm a doctor with comparison to other Israelis that really don't know anything about the Jewry of America. But I wanted one thing to tell you. Maybe this is emotional. Look, I am running around the world. I meet with a lot of Jewish congregations around the world. South Africa, Australia, America, Canada, Europe, wherever you look. And many times I'm invited to Shabbat dinner and to houses of people that I meet only for 2 hours. I believe that I won't see them again. And when I enter the house and see at the Shabbat dinner, that table, and how the family is sitting all together, and first of all singing something, and talking and praying, and eating and speaking politics, and I think to myself, well, it's exactly as my home. I haven't met those people, I don't know them, but we are so much connected. Our culture is so deep that in a minute you feel that as if you entered your own family. So I believe in the Jewish people. I think it's a value, in my opinion, although I'm secular.
Don't call yourself names.
So I just wanted to respond to a couple of the points that Rabbi Shafran made, which I largely agree with, but two responses. First of all, I agree that we can think of the issue not in terms of a kind of monolithic American Jewish community set against a monolithic Israeli Jewish community. Absolutely, there are dividing lines within these two communities. And that's also important, that Israeli Jews also differ. I think if we look at the camps, if you like, within these two communities, you'll see that actually the kind of left liberal camp among Israeli Jews is much smaller than the equivalent camp is among American Jews. But absolutely there are divisions running between. In fact, this is really, in some respects, a transnational divide over, in some ways, different conceptions of Jewish identity, different understandings of Jewish history, different emphases upon particularism versus universalism, and there's nothing new in this. I think sometimes we forget that politically, religiously, and culturally, there's never been Jewish unity. Jewish unity is a myth. If we look at the historical record, there's always been religious divisions, political divisions. So to some extent, I think we need to give up this notion of this norm that somehow that is what we should aspire to. I think we need to rather accept pluralism in Jewish life. But the other point I would make in response to your remark about the demographics and the growth of the Orthodox community, which is certainly true, and in fact I write about this in my book, but I also think when we think about, there's a danger with non-demographers talking about demographics here. the Orthodox community in the United States today is 10%, of which about 7% are ultra-Orthodox and just 3% are modern Orthodox. So the idea, which is obviously a comforting one now in Israeli government circles, that Orthodox Jewry are poised to take over the American Jewish communities, flies in the face of demographic data, which is that a community that's 10% is not going to become a majority for a very long time. And that doesn't consider what is also outgrowth from the community. In other words, we're talking about the increasing number of, largely the reason why the community is growing is because there's much higher birth rates. But it would be eventually, yes, I agree with you, the weight of the Orthodox community, already the influence is growing, and certainly that does bode well because that community is more attached to Israel and there's a stronger relationship. But I think but we need to understand that long-term trend, is not immune from out-marriage, reductions of birth rates, etc., so it will slow down in time. But ultimately, it's going to be decades before Orthodox Jewry rival in numbers non-Orthodox Jewry. And on the flip side, when we think about non-Orthodox Jews in the United States, looking at synagogue attendance or affiliation with Jewish organizations is a very misleading way of understanding what's really happening. Yes, non-Orthodox Jews are less likely now to belong to synagogues, but there are so many other forms of religious, cultural, political engagement happening within the non-Orthodox Jewish community in this country, Jewish communities in this country. In fact, far from it being a community on decline, I think it's actually vibrant and growing. Often we think about intermarriage as a loss of Jews. These people are moving, but the data shows that actually the children of intermarried couples are much more likely today to identify as Jews. In many ways, these are communities that are actually growing and flourishing, but the ways in which they practice Jewishness, the ways in which they think of Jewishness is very different and not always measurable in the kind of traditional metrics. So yes, synagogue attendance might be declining, but that doesn't mean that religiosity or spiritual life is declining. So I think there is this idea now, and even among secular Jews, whether it be in Israel or in the United States, that somehow the future belongs to Orthodoxy and non-Orthodox are just kind of gradually fading into obsolescence. I think that really does a disservice to what is actually happening and the vibrancy of Jewish life in this country. And also, as I said, it leads to false expectations about the future. This belief that somehow just around the corner there's going to be this very comfortable relationship between these two communities. So I agree with you that there is this Orthodox, even among, by the way, Orthodox Jews in this country, there's a divide between Orthodox Jews in this country and those in Israel. They don't share. But I think we have to kind of look more closely at the question of what's happening in terms of Jewish life.
But the progression is a geometric.
Excuse me. I do have a metric, and that's my inbox. So, I live in lots and lots of bubbles. I have family members who are Orthodox, Sephardic Orthodox, Chabad Orthodox, complete atheists. I have militant gay Reconstructionist relatives. I have, the whole range. And I talk to lots of people, and my inbox is full. It's like so much going on in Judaism and so much going on in the American Jewish community. I wish you could see it. Maybe I should write about it. There are so many new spiritual groups coming up. There are art groups. There are politics groups. There is music. I happen to love music. There is social justice. There's all sorts of expressions of groups that I've never even heard of. They're just people sitting in their room creating groups and then connecting to a community and creating communities. They've created apps. They've created all these things, and they are not creating them within the synagogue, which is a different story, but it is a very alive Jewish community that I live in and that I see. Now some of that comes from Orthodoxy as well. So it's happening everywhere, not just within the unaffiliated, which I think is even an old word, but I think it's a good word. So I guess that I think it's people forget that, and you don't get to see it like the way I get to see it from sitting in my little office in my inbox and then going out and talking to people all over the world.
I have to say that take issue with the fact that we're not talking here about a simple progression, but a geometric one. There is a tremendous, we mentioned birth rate, there's a tremendous difference between the less than replacement level of non-Orthodox Jews in America today and the much higher birth rate, many times over replacement level, the Orthodox one. With regard to intermarried families, I quote again from Wertheimer, among the non-Orthodox population between ages 25 and 54, 36% of mixed marrieds are not raising their children as Jewish at all. 44% say their children are being raised partly as Jews or with no Jewish religion, leaving only 20% claiming to raise their children exclusively in the Jewish religion. One can be an optimist, but one should not be a Pollyanna. This does not bode well for the intermarried community. Again, not making a judgment call on intermarriage, but simply it is not a path of strengthening the Jewish community, but quite the opposite. With regard, again, to the demographics, all I can say is that my late father came over from Siberia by way of, he was a guest of the Soviet government during the war, and all expense paid trip there. And he came over with nothing, and his whole family had been destroyed during the Holocaust. When he died just over a year ago, he left hundreds of grandchildren, and every one of those grandchildren is being raised in an observant Orthodox home. All of his grandchildren, of which he had, I don't know, 40 or 50, all of those grandchildren are now parents and raising their children that way. Are there defections from Orthodoxy? Of course there are, but they're few and far between. Just every one of them's written a memoir, so we seem to feel that somehow it's a larger phenomenon than it really is. But I'll tell you what I find when I go to a show anywhere in the country, whether it's more to the left of where I am on the spectrum or to the right, I always meet people who are what they call balei tshuva, which is a term I don't like. I feel myself I'm a balei tshuva. I try to become one, try to do repentance whenever I can. But these are people who were raised in non-Orthodox environments who've come to Orthodoxy and are now raising Orthodox families. Again, I don't mean this as one-upmanship, but I have to, I don't want to use the word warn, but I want to state the facts of the matter that this is a geometric progression, and that it's not one that's going to take many generations to be realized. It's going to be realized in the next 1 or 2 generations. And we have to recognize that fact, and whether one is happy with it or unhappy with it, deal with it.
Thank you. From the expression of some people in the audience, eye-rolling, I'm sure that we'll continue to discuss this topic later on. But I want to move beyond the Jewish community to the general American scenery, and again, that's my personal inclination to talk about politics. Now, for decades, the US relationship with Israel has been sustained by a bipartisan consensus in Washington. There was a very good article published a few days ago by Aaron David Miller and Stephen Simon, and they argued, which is something that we all know, that this bipartisanship has changed. And we know today that while the overall support for Israel has not changed, a dramatic difference occurred between Republicans and Democrats. The number of the Republicans that support Israel today is about 79%, rose from 49 to 79. While the number of Democrats has declined from 44 to 27. So it's a huge gap. And this gap is really represented by the future coalition. African Americans, Latino, Asians, Catholics, young people. So if this process will continue, not in a long time, we'll see a major shift in American support and understanding of Israel.
Professor, can I interrupt you for a minute? What was the way of defining pro-Israel regarding that? It's very interesting to me.
It's true, and I won't go into details, but there were several surveys on that, particularly on the question of the Palestinian, Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinian. I did a research myself when I came to this university 8 years ago, and I asked students about their position to Israel. Then I knew that the general support of the American public, general support of Israel by American public is about 65–66%, while the support for the Palestinians was about 18%. So I did a survey among students, and I found to my amazement then, now I know a little bit more, that only a third of the students supported Israel. Now, I didn't see any dramatic increase of support for the Palestinians. So the rest were either I don't know, or both are right, or both are wrong. But I could see that the beginning of that process. And we see that now more and more, and it will continue in the future. So isn't the topic of the relations between Israel and American Jewry a reflection of a wider trend in American society, where liberals are moving away, running away from Israel, while the Republicans continue to support Israel? And Shibli Telhami did another survey on the Christian extremists, and he saw there that there it went up even more dramatically, not 79, but 99%. So aren't we witnessing among us a reflection of a much wider and more severe trend? Dov.
First of all, I think I would agree. These surveys are problematic in the way in which they measure support for Israel. A, because they frame it in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so really they're asking which side do you pick, which is not necessarily a good measure. And also they set it up as a zero sum. So in other words, you're either for Israel or you're against the Palestinians. So I think there is a problem in this particular, in the ways in which these surveys are done that measure attitudes. That said, clearly there is a shift, I think, among liberals, among the most, so not necessarily among Democrats in general, but among liberals. And I think that goes to partly a question that was mentioned earlier, which is a growing growing awareness among liberals in the United States that the issues that Israel has are not just vis-a-vis Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza or East Jerusalem, but also that there is a tension between Israel's Jewishness and its democratic character, and that that liberals are increasingly aware of this tension and the ways in which it's manifested, whether it be in anti-democratic legislation or sentiments or statements against the Palestinian minority in Israel. So I think there is this shift that in the past you could be solidly progressive and liberal and support Israel even in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That changed a long time ago. And now the shift is not just about the conflict, it's not just about the occupation, but it's also about Israel's very identity. And that is where the debate is increasingly shifting. And I do think you're seeing that, and that debate, which is among liberals in general, is also happening very much among young liberal American Jews.
Sure, if you see that the keynote speaker at the ZOA conference is Bannon, you cannot stay relaxed and objective and neutral.
Well, I just want to add something different. I think it's actually a much bigger problem than just the opinion about Israel. You know, when I was in Israel, I gave a talk about anti-Semitism on the right and anti-Semitism on the left in the United States. And I think we need to be educating people about Israel, but American Jews need to be educating minorities in the United States, particularly like some of the leaders in Black Lives Matter, Women's March. These are important movements about American Jews and about American Jewish roles and civil rights. You know, that we've sort of let down our guard in lots and lots of ways. So it's a bigger issue than Israel.
All right, we can open the floor to questions. Who is willing to be the first one? Please introduce yourself. Where is the mic? The mic, yeah, there are mics.
Hi, I'm Mindy Reiser. I've worked internationally, and this is a wonderful panel. I want to talk a little bit, and Talia, you touched on this, and others did too, about the links between the Jewish communities outside the United States and Israel and the American Jewish community. American Jews, many of them are fairly well off. They travel, they have family in other parts of the world. And there are interesting gatherings like limud, which means study. These are intensive, sometimes several-day discussions on Jewish culture, text, etc. And there are differences in observance. So my kind of convoluted point here is that there are different definitions of being Jewish in different places, and we've heard about these wonderful alternatives and new organizations. How prevalent is this elsewhere? Is this uniquely American? Are we seeing these alternative expressions of Judaism elsewhere? How does this affect diaspora communities outside the US and their relationship to Israel? You've talked about your wonderful Friday night gatherings, but these are probably middle class to upper middle class families. They're not single mothers. There probably are people who have already some grounding. They may have gone to Hebrew day schools, etc. But I'm curious about the interweavings of something called the world Jewish community, how this plays out and where this is going, and the transference of influences among these people and how they affect Israel and political developments. It's a huge question, but I'm curious what you want to say.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in this. I just could share with you my experience. And as much as I could say, I've seen in South Africa, Australia, Canada, in different ways, but always London, Paris, Zurich, many places that I've been to, the Jewish people are being divided, conservatives and liberals. You could call them progressives here in America, and you know, and conservatives, or I don't know, find another name. But many of them are divided between two ways of looking at the whole thing that's called Israel, involved with Judaism, and I think that the progressives or liberals, they're ready to speak about criticism about the government of Israel and Israel's policy. Sometimes they don't allow themselves to speak up, and they speak with you silently, not publicly. I've been to Oxford in a conference with Jews of Europe, and I spoke there. I speak the same way, here, there, and in Israel. And after that, they came to me and said, "We're so happy that you can allow yourself to say that, but we can't." So there is a debate around the world, in the Jewish world, this is what I think, in my impression, between people that allow themselves to speak up and those who don't. And there is always a debate if it's allowed, yes or no, to criticize Israel. Many of them suffer of Israel's policy since the anti-Semitic activities against congregations have increased.
Thank you. Scott, can you bring the mic to Joe, please? Thank you.
I have a question here. I'm sorry, I was waiting. Did you see me?
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Howard Marks, great panel. So sort of the other elephant in the room is the growing Muslim population in the United States. And on America's campuses today, we have what's called the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestiture Movement. And almost every campus is affected. So just two anecdotes, and then I'll leave it to the panel to discuss. The first is my son was a student at George Mason University. He was fairly ambivalent about Israel. He wasn't against it, but he wasn't much favorable at either, or talked about it. Then the BDS movement came to George Mason, and they set up these checkpoints, like where students couldn't get through. So within a matter of like months, my son signed up for a birthright trip, even it was during the Intifada. He now lives in Los Angeles. He is a fervent Zionist, thanks to BDS. At my alma mater, Northwestern University, there was also the growth of the BDS movement. And there, I say and also trying to shut down free speech on campus from pro-Israel speakers. And there, much to my chagrin, or not to my chagrin, but favorably, the president acted decisively to make sure that free speech was preserved at the Northwestern campus under these University of Chicago rules, and so on. So maybe the group could talk a little bit about what suddenly we have students on campuses, thanks to different organizations like Israel on Campus, that are now starting to give students tools to fight back against the BDS movement. And now I see, at least in my family, a growing interest in Israel and a growing sense that Israel needs to be protected and defended. Thank you.
So if we learn from your son's experience, the government of Israel should support the BDS movement. The reaction will be more Zionist. That's a joke.
Just very quick response. You may have the impression that BDS appears on every campus and is growing across the United States because of the amount of media attention in the Jewish media it receives, but actually the vast, vast majority of campuses in this country have no BDS activity whatsoever. BDS, where it exists, is really limited to a small number, relatively small number of admittedly elite universities or private liberal arts colleges, but it is naturally something like 95% of campuses in this country have not had a single divestment resolution. So I think there is this false conception about what's happening on American college campuses. As somebody who teaches on one, I can speak to this. That somehow, BDS is sweeping across American college campuses, winning time and again, and Jewish students are kind of cowering under their desks in the face of this BDS offensive. It's really inaccurate, and I think it actually conveys a sense that what was one of the most important vehicles for Jewish success in this country and upward mobility, namely higher education, is in fact now somehow an enemy of the American Jewish community. And I think that's a really, really dangerous idea. In fact, as I said, the vast majority of campuses don't have that. Where they do have that, which is in just a small percentage, they have divestment resolutions which ultimately go nowhere. There's not been a single case in which these divestment resolutions have actually been enacted by the Board of Trustees. The impact, I think, on Jewish students on those campuses is mixed, and I think there is an issue with how Jewish students who identify as pro-Israel can feel often put upon or besieged in those very divisive debates. Not all Jewish students, and I think, again, we have to not overgeneralize about the experiences of Jewish students. But I just want to push back very strongly against this false conception that somehow BDS is taking over American campuses. They're becoming, some would say, anti-Semitic. It's a myth, and I think it's a pernicious one.
Sure, go ahead.
I want to say something that's probably very politically incorrect, so I'll give that disclaimer ahead of time. Oh, can you not hear me? Can you hear me now, Aviva? Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to say something politically correct. Incorrect, excuse me. So much attention goes to BDS and so much funding goes into fighting BDS on campuses. Every group I talk to has some kind of group that is working on campus and is going to donors and getting money to go fight BDS on campus. Hey, we need to spend some of that money doing some other things, like working on how Jews are perceived in the United States. We have anti-Semitism issues on the right as well as on the left. The ones on the left are happening on these little sheltered oases, which are universities, where kids are not really out there completely on their own. And there are other bigger problems happening. So I just think that BDS is an important thing to be conscious of. We have to educate people about BDS, but we need to be educating everybody about BDS, and I think spending some of that money in different ways.
Thank you. Yes, Joe, please.
My thought on this BDS, how to confront it, really have to look at the Institute for Israel Studies here at the University of Maryland. Not only is there a Israel Studies program, but a Jewish Studies program, Sadat Chair, Persian Study program, and there's dialogue among the group. And as a result, BDS has not really taken root at the university, and I'm very proud of that. Let me just comment. I was U.S. ambassador to Switzerland and lived there 4 years. And the Jewish community in Switzerland is very subtle. They don't like to say, I'm Jewish, but it does exist, and they're strong. I remember Alma and I attended a conference in Bergenstock, and we were mostly Gentile people there. But people would come up to me and whisper, Lashana Tova, which was quite interesting. I think the Jewish, as you indicated, Professor, I won't call us we're a culture, we're one. And even though we have our disagreements, we are Jewish and love our culture, and we remain strong in that regard.
Thank you. Last year, there was an attempt at the university here by students to have a BDS resolution at the student senate, and it failed. I don't think that they will try next year again. But 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting conference at the GW in Washington on the Nakba. They didn't celebrate the 70th anniversary of Israel. They celebrated only 70th anniversary of the Nakba. And I was told there that a motion there last year, the student motion failed, but most likely it will gain the support in the near future. So, oh, it did? Passed? What? Ah.
And Barnard just passed
Wow,
last
that's
week.
interesting. Yeah, sure.
I just want to say something maybe a little bit different. I think the problem of Israel is not a BDS. I think that the problem of Israel is not a Hasbara. I think that the problem of Israel is changing its policy. And without doing that, we won't solve anything.
Thank you. Please, introduce yourself. Yeah.
From the Gilbert Horn Institute and PhD student here at the University of Maryland. I'm a Palestinian citizen of Israel, so obviously this is very relevant to me as well. And I have actually a number of questions. First of all, we've talked a lot about the differences between the communities, whether it's the levels of religiosity or income or whatnot. But I also wanted to ask about ethnicity and maybe the differences in ethnic difference. I mean, the plurality of Jews in Israel today are of Mizrahi origin, while the overwhelming majority of American Jews are of Ashkenazi descent. Do you think this plays into the issue? A second question, and this is more towards Dr. Waxman, but if anybody else would like to. We all know that the Jewish community in the United States has a special sensitivity towards minority rights, beginning with Rabbi Eshel and all the way up. Do you think that Israel's policy of statutory discrimination towards its Arab population, you wrote a book about the issue, actually affects the way American Jews, especially the younger generation of American Jews, perceive Israel, or is that not very significant? And my final question to all of you is, how do you explain the fact that, well, this isn't Bibi Netanyahu's fault, but in the era of Israel's first American prime minister, you have this divergence between the two communities. How do you explain that? Thank you.
Okay, to answer, thank you for great questions. I'll answer your second question first in terms of does the issue of the discrimination of Palestinian citizens of Israel affect how young American Jews. I think when they learn about it, to the extent to which they're made aware of it, and I mean, obviously, if they just go on a Birthright tour of Israel, they're not going to be made aware of it, particularly because Birthright now has cancelled those meetings, which used to take place with Palestinian citizens of Israel. But when they do, absolutely, I think one of the reasons, as I alluded to earlier, that there's a growing debate among young liberal American Jews, not only about the occupation and the issues, the conflict with the Palestinians, but also about Israel's very Jewishness, about whether Israel can be a Jewish and democratic state. What they mean there by that in particular is, can it uphold the principles of equality that American Jews are kind of deeply committed to? And I think that is, as that issue becomes more known in the American Jewish community, I think it does generate a debate. I would just say, though, that on that issue, specifically, American Jews have really been at the forefront. I mean, the support for the NIF, for example, on the issue of Palestinian citizens of Israel has really been pushed by American Jews. On the question of the ethnic differences, and I think you're absolutely right, we haven't mentioned that. Obviously, well, I think we need to bear in mind that American Jewry is not as monolithic as some people imagine. There is actually more racial and ethnic diversity among American Jews than is often acknowledged. So American Jews aren't all quote-unquote white. But that said, there is obviously the majority are Ashkenazi Jews who come from Eastern Europe, and as you point out, that is not the case among Israeli Jews. I think that does play in. I don't want to essentialize ethnic difference and say, oh, if you're Mizrahi, you necessarily are going to be more traditional or right-wing. But I think what I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the gap that's opening up between American Jews and Israel isn't just a gap between American Jews and the Israeli government, but rather these are deeper societal shifts. And one of these is what's happened in Israel over the last 30 years is that previously marginalized groups in Israeli society, first and foremost Mizrahim, have become increasingly empowered, increasingly visible and influential. And that's reshaped, for better in many ways, Israeli culture and Israeli politics. But that means then that for Ashkenazi Jews, Israel is not the Israel that they grew up imagining it to be. Israel is a different kind of place culturally, politically, and religiously. And so I think part of that is because of the empowerment, which, as I said, is a good process, but a consequence of that has been, in fact, to widen the gap between these two communities.
The distribution of positions in Israel regarding all these issues that we discussed, the rule of law, the attitudes towards the Palestinians, Israeli Palestinians, the West Bank, etc., the highest correlation is not ethnicity, but religion. And if you compare the Israeli polls since 1970, divide Israelis to ultra-religious, Haredim, religious, Masortiim, traditionalist, and secular. And all the questions on all these issues, and particularly on democratic values, you see a very high correlation between level of religiosity and positive or negative attitudes towards democracy. While the majority are democratic, like in the Western world, among seculars you will find 90% who support democratic values, and among the ultra-Orthodox, 30%, sometimes even less than that. So beyond ethnicity, it's the level of religion. Now, religion in the Israeli perception, not spiritual values, but being practicing Jew or more liberal Jew. Sure. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Hannah Ehlers, and I work at NAF in DC. And I kind of want to go back to the demographics issue. I just want to say that I'm a product of an interfaith family. My grandfather was a Lutheran minister, and my sister and I were raised Jewish in big part because of the welcoming Reform rabbis and Jewish community at Temple Sinai in DC. And I think we should be careful linking intermarriage with decline in Jewish identity and focus more on why intermarried Jews don't always feel like there's space for them in traditional Jewish institutions. And I think the way that we often discuss intermarriage often puts Jewish blood over Jewish meaning. And I want to know how we get past all of this fear about changing demographics, which I think kind of just stagnates us and entrenches the status quo, so that we can actually do the work that will move the Jewish community to uphold our values and stand for equality and democracy both here and in Israel.
Thank you. Well put. Please, Joe. Go ahead.
Okay, so it seemed to me that that part of this division between Jews in America and Israel is very natural as an historical event. That is, you had obviously tremendous support for Israel that grew out of the Holocaust and the founding of it. But as time has gone on, those families that didn't have relatives in Israel would become less and less attached to Israel, just naturally, and less concerned about Israel. I wonder if people have studied, sort of as a benchmark, the issues of what you would expect if you do not have relatives versus if you do have relatives, and what you would expect in terms of deteriorating relations with Israel merely because of the distance from the time of the Holocaust.
Well, there's a lot of studies out about 1967. 1967 was the heyday, or the strongest connection between American Jews and Israel, and probably Jews all around the world in Israel. So that was, there's been, I think, many studies on that I've read.
I don't know so much about American Jews, but about Israelis. I have a theory which was not yet tested. But I believe that beyond the differences between religiosity, as I said earlier, ethnicity, or whatever, the major difference regarding democratic values among Israelis is their connectivity to the world. The more ties you have to the world, professional, family, cultural, educational, sabbaticals, years spent abroad, etc., the more liberal you are. The more secluded you are, the more close you are, the less you'll have the democratic and humanitarian values. But I call any student who wants to do a thesis on that, I'll help him to do it. It's an interesting question.
There's also a lot of studies about how more Israelis are traveling now, so that's really opened up their mind. That didn't really happen until the 1990s, when there was enough money in the economy for people to travel, and it became, so that has really changed people in Israel.
Just to answer the question about the role that the Holocaust plays specifically, it's not linear. It actually, first of all, we haven't got survey data from how American Jews felt in the 1950s. But when measurements started, actually American Jewish attachment to Israel grew in the 1960s and 1970s, not as opposed to being kind of a linear decline. And part of that was because Holocaust consciousness, or the collective memory of the Holocaust, became more central in American Jewish identity and public life, and so attachment to Israel. Where I think where it does play a particular role is in the belief in the necessity of a Jewish state. Not so much an emotional attachment to Israel, which, as I said, for the time being hasn't really declined, despite what everybody believes. 2/3 of American Jews are attached, and that hasn't really shifted greatly, fluctuates slightly. But in terms of the question of the necessity for a Jewish state, the role that the Holocaust played in convincing American Jews who were previously, for the most part, non-Zionist, in the necessity for a Jewish state was central. The Holocaust played a central role in that. And as the memory of the Holocaust weakens in some sense, or becomes universalized in other ways, then again, going back to this point I was making earlier, that now increasingly there's the debate not just about Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, but about Jewish statehood itself and the necessity of Jewish statehood. That is, I think, linked to the kind of weakening or the attenuation of the memory of the Holocaust.
Let me add to that point something else. We brought 4 or 5 years ago A.B. Yehoshua, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, and he gave a very interesting talk here. He has a very strong opinion about Judaism in Israel, and he puts it in a very short sentence. He said that you cannot be fully a Jew unless you are an Israeli. Position that I don't support. But a serious public opinion, it's serious research in Israel asks a different question. What do you think should be, I don't know what the question was, but 83% of the Israelis said that Israel is the center of the Jewish world, while only 17% said that Israel and Jews outside Israel, mainly the US, are equally two equal centers. I wonder if we had a survey here, how many would say that Israel is the center of the Jewish world, and how many would say that Israel and the United States are equal centers? Should I ask you or not? Yes. All right, so raise your hands. Who believes that Israel is the center? The second question would be, who believes that Israel and the United States are equal? Who believes that Israel is the center? All right, and what about the other option? It's about two-thirds and a third, more or less, 60-40. Interesting. For two centers. 70-30? You see, it's not easy to interpret the figures. All right, now Noah, and please Noah, introduce yourself, because Noah, I have to say that. Noah is our first PhD student, an excellent student. She's going to finish very shortly.
Yoram is so hopeful about my dissertation.
Sorry?
You're so hopeful about my dissertation process.
and tell us what's the topic of your dissertation, please.
I write about how progressive ambition impacts the likelihood that women parliament members will advocate for women, essentially arguing that over time, women will want to expand their legislative agenda and they'll decrease their support for women and social issues. Basically, I look at institutional constraints and the likelihood that women will be represented in parliaments. And I look at Israel and Argentina. I basically think my thought process was that if in Israel a woman wants to be elected as prime minister, she has to have a position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And therefore is unlikely to perhaps focus on the continued existence of deep gender inequality in Israel.
Thank you. And your question?
Afterwards, I'll happily receive comments on my 30-second elevator speech. But I had a number of comments. One, I am the product of numerous communities that you discussed. I am the granddaughter of an interfaith marriage. My parents are American Olim that immigrated to Israel in the 70s. And I grew up Reform in Israel in the 1990s, so made Aliyah. Aliti LaTorah, sorry. I'm sorry. To the entire Orthodox community. I wanted to ask a number of questions and to continue Thar's question about the ethnicity issue, especially as Jewish Americans engage with racial issues in the United States and their place in the racial dynamic. And what I have found is that for the Jewish American community, particularly for younger American Jews, this issue of, well, we are identified as white, and therefore, if we apply the racial paradigm of the United States to Israel and look at discrimination against Mizrahim, Ethiopians, even Soviet Jewry, this issue of privilege and power, and thinking about that in the Israeli context, well, we have a lot of criticism about that, and how do we engage with that? I think that there hasn't been a lot of discussion about intersectionality issues, whether it's gender or race or queerness in Israel or in the Jewish American community, which continue to be fraught and complicated. And I think for example, this issue, like for an American woman who goes to Israel and then all of a sudden maybe she has to sit on a gender-separated bus. Like, what does that experience look like, and how does that experience in Israel impact her? I also kind of want to comment on like the Israeli tourism issue, which a lot of times there's like a very colonialist aspect to going to India. And I think that we're just not addressing this in an intersectional analysis. Thank you.
Well, can I say something?
Sure.
Because I just spoke about intersectionality in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the Women's March in Israel when I was at this conference in Jerusalem. And everyone wanted me to talk about BDS. And no one wanted to hear about Black Lives Matters in Women's March. And I was actually the only woman on the panel, and the reason I went was because I was the only woman on the panel, and I didn't want 3 men to be discussing this, 4 men to be discussing it without at least one American woman being there, let alone one woman. And so I just want to say that I think the Black Lives Matter movement is really an important movement, and that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about that and what American Jewish community role is in that, and teaching about the history of the American Jewish partnership in the civil rights movement, and what's gone on since then to people in that movement, and that this is a slightly different version, but that we're kind of missing the boat. And also, in terms of the Women's March, there needs to be a lot of discussion. The main takeaway, if I hadn't been on that panel in Israel, which was made up of mostly, again, a man from Iran, 2 men from Britain, 1 from the United States who did not do this, but that the Women's March was Marxist. And I mean, I was just kind of like astounded. Ooh, excuse me. I think you have absolutely no clue of what's going on in the United States. When I said earlier that I think we need to spend some of our money that we're spending on BDS on campus, I think we need to spend some of that money on thinking about Black Lives Matters and the Women's March, which I think are actually 2 very important movements. So.
Thank you. We'll take the last question for this I think that Aviva was first. So we'll take two sorry? A comment, all right. So we'll take a comment and last question. There will be many more later. I see more hands, but we don't have the time.
I can't help but comment on the, going back 2 questions, that when you look at the American Jewish community, the connection with the community, et cetera, the statistics show, unless they changed in the last 2 years, that a lot of it depends on whether your family, how far you are away from your immigrant roots. And that's something that no one mentioned, and it's a very important and interesting point.
Thank you. And our last question.
I want to go back to Talia Sasson's presentation. You said that we share a set of values. I totally agree with. So I'm wondering where those values come from. Are they coming from Herzl or Ahad Ha'am, or from Martin Buber, or from Rav Kook? Or just to give you a sense of the diversity, or do the values on democracy come from John Locke? Where do the values come from that are really dominating our thinking, really for the entire panel?
Well, to where the values comes from, where your values comes from. Mine from reading a lot of books when I was a child. I believe that Jewish stories, history books, and others gives you values. The home that you are being grown in gives you values. Your parents and your friends, the surrounding of yours, you learn things or you don't learn. So in the end of the day, and you learn something at school, but not so much. So in the end of the day, every one of us is a product of something that is very difficult to define. And I believe that all the intellectual things and emotional that we are growing on are giving us the set of values that we're talking about. In the end of the day, when you look at a democracy society, you know that those people, they know to differ between bad and wrong and good things. They know few things that we all share, although we never spoke about it. These are the values.
For my part,
Just one sentence, please. I want you, all 3 of you, to sum up. So if you want to add another sentence, not much more than that, and you will do the same, that we'll be able to conclude our session, our panel.
Yeah.
Story of my life. For my part, values are fungible, and they are also applicable in different ways by different people. Values are not always, they exist in idealized forms, and yet when put into practice, they often can be can yield things that one would not hope they yield. Rather than going into examples, it's not the place for it, but I don't put a lot of value on values as the term is used. To me, there's only one value. Again, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I don't like labels. I'm a Jew. But I'm a Jew who has respect for the Jewish religious tradition. All of my values come from that. I absorb the values of the society around me, but I gauge them based on how they intersect with what the Torah and the generations and generations of Jewish development in fealty to the Torah have yielded. So I think that's the value system that I come to, and it's not one that yields anything terribly radical by contemporary standards, but it is different in some ways, and I make no apologies for that.
So, yeah, I actually don't think we share common values. I think it's a comforting idea that Jews all share common values. What we can see quite clearly is, in fact, that there are different emphases, different sets of values, and what Jews share is a tradition in which those values are debated and argued. Right? It's not that there is a consensus about the values, whether it be among Jews, Muslims, Christians, or any other religious, ethnic, or cultural group. In fact, values are what we argue about. Different people have different values. Within the Jewish community, it's the idiom, it's the Jewish idiom or textual tradition in which we used to argue about those values. But I think the notion that somehow, we all share a common, even among Americans, it's simply untrue that Americans share common values. We can see this very, very clearly in the last couple of years. They don't all share values about fairness or equality. On the contrary, values are the things we argue about, but we have different languages or traditions in which we use to make that argument.
Thank you. Nadine, on that question, or any other thing that you want to say?
I agree completely with what Dov is saying, that it's the conversation, it's how we have the conversation, it's how we speak with one another, it's how we listen to one another. I think that there is an incredible amount to learn from the tradition of the Talmud and the kind of arguments that went into that. So I think that Jewish learning and Torah learning does have a part of that. But I think that there are you can take things from that without actually studying Torah and without studying Talmud. And I actually think that a lot of Jewish thinking has become part of American education and part of what education is today. And so I come back to, I think my main point of everything is that we need to do a lot. We need to be educating about different things, about how to have a conversation, about how to understand each other, how American Jews should understand Israel. Very important how Israeli Jews and Israeli non-Jews should understand the United States. And that it's the education gap, I think, that we're really talking about today.
So I just would like to say that, first of all, about the values. I don't want to discuss it here because I don't think that this panel dealt with it. And it's, a philosophical point of view that we could share a long conversation between us now if we have shared values or not. But I want to be focused, you'll be surprised, on Israel. I came here only because of that, to speak about Israel, to explain about Israel the much as I can with this short time, to tell you about the problems that we have there and we have, and to try to call you to join us, Israelis, that understand what are the values of democracy are. Join us with our fight to maintain Israel's democracy.
Thank you, Talia. Thank you for the excellent questions that you raised. And as Farid Zakaria finishes each one of his panels, it was an excellent panel, outstanding panel. Now we are going to take a break of 15 minutes, and then we'll meet here at 12 o'clock to hear an even more outstanding, fantastic lecture. I do promise you, I know the person who is going to say that. Thank you.